Welcome to the deep dive. You've handed us a truly fascinating stack of material, and well, our mission today is to plunge right into it, pull out the most important insights, the aha moments hidden within.
Exactly. Think of this as your shortcut, really, to getting well informed on one of the ancient world's big mysteries. We're guided here only by what the archaeologists dug up and what the researchers wrote down in the sources you've shared.
Right. Today we're diving deep into the Harappan, or Indus Valley civilization, one of the oldest urban cultures we know about. And we're sticking strictly to these sources, looking at what they actually left behind, their bricks, beads, and bones, as they say, and how people have tried to piece together their story.
We'll uncover some pretty surprising details. Their planned cities, for instance, are remarkable. We'll try to glimpse their daily lives, trace their connections. Some went really far, and wrestle with the big questions, the mysteries they left. Especially that script. Still unreadable.
Yeah, that script, it's a journey into this really complex society, and all we have is the material stuff. So let's unpack this. Okay, so kicking us off, the sources mention the Harappan culture. What does an archaeologist actually mean by culture here? Is it like art and music?
No, not quite like that. It's a good question, though. For archaeologists, culture is more technical. It means a specific set of distinctive objects, things like their unique seals, certain types of beads, weights, those stone blades, baked bricks, too, that you consistently find together.
Together in the same place from the same time period?
Exactly. Across a specific area, within a specific time frame, it's basically a way to identify a particular group of people and their way of life just from the stuff they left behind. Their material footprint, you could say.
And for the Harappans, this footprint is huge, right?
Yeah.
The sources say these objects pop up all over Afghanistan, Jammu, Baluchistan, down into Gujarat.
It's a vast area, yeah, covering modern-day Pakistan and northwest India. And it gets its name, Harappan, because Harappa was the very first place these particular things were found and recognized way back.
Uh-huh.
We'll mostly be talking about the main phase, the mature Harappan period, which is roughly 2600 to 1900 BCE. That's when the big cities were really thriving. But it's important to remember there were earlier phases, early Harappan, and later ones too, late Harappan, in the same general areas.
It's just amazing how much we think we know just from these objects.
Yeah.
Which I guess leads to a really core point in your sources. Pretty much everything we understand comes from archaeological evidence. Houses, pots, tools.
Absolutely. Since we can't read their writing, it all comes down to interpreting the physical stuff they left in the ground. And that's the key word, interpretation. It's based on the evidence we have now.
And those interpretations can change.
Oh, definitely. New discoveries happen, or we develop new ways to analyze things, and suddenly the picture shifts.
Right. And some things, like you said, that script, maybe we'll just never know for sure unless we get lucky, like finding a bilingual text or something.
Exactly. A Rosetta Stone for the Indus. Before these big cities popped up, the sources talk about earlier cultures in the area, these early Harappan folks.
Right. They had their own pottery, farming, crafts, but smaller settlements, less grand.
Generally, yes. Smaller villages, not really any massive buildings like you see later. And there seems to have been some kind of break, a disruption between the early and the mature periods.
How so?
Some sites show evidence of large-scale burning or being abandoned right before the mature Harappan phase really takes off. Yeah. Suggests a significant shift, maybe not entirely peaceful everywhere.
Okay, so let's get into their daily lives in those big cities. How do they feed everyone? What were they eating?
Well, the evidence suggests a pretty broad diet. Plants, animals, even fish. Archaeologists figure this out by studying the tiny remains they find.
Like burnt seeds and stuff.
Exactly. Charred grains and seeds, that's what archaeobotanists look at. And animal bones, which archaeozoologists study.
And they found things like wheat, barley, lentils, chickpeas, sesame too. Millets seem important in Gujarat. But rice was rare, interestingly.
Seems that way, yeah.
Yeah.
For animals, the bones show lots of domesticated species. Cattle, sheep, goat, buffalo, pig, typical farm animals. But they also found bones from wild animals, boar, deer, even gharials, the crocodiles. We don't know for sure if the Harappans themselves hunted these or maybe traded for them. Fish and bird bones too, so quite varied.
Okay, farming was clearly happening.
Yeah.
But how? How did they actually work the land? It's hard to tell just from finding grain.
It is tricky, but we have clues. We see bulls on seals and in little sculptures, so that strongly suggests they use oxen for plowing. We even found actual terracotta models of plows.
Those toy plows.
Kind of. Found at places like Khalistan and Banawali, and there's that really cool find at Calibangan, an actual plowed field from the early Harappan times.
Oh yeah, the one with the crossing furrows. What did that mean again?
It looks like they might have been growing 2 different crops in the same field at the same time. 2 sets of furrows at right angles. Pretty sophisticated way to use the land.
Smart. What about harvesting? Any ideas?
That's still a bit of a question mark. Did they use stone blades stuck in wooden handles? Or maybe early metal tools? Archaeologists are trying to figure that out. Given where most sites are, semi-arid land, irrigation must have been essential.
Right. But you said evidence for big canals is rare. Only in Afghanistan.
Yeah, clear traces of canals are only found at Shortahai. It's possible canals in the main Indus region just silted up over thousands of years. Hard to say. But it seems more likely they relied heavily on wells for water.
Wells make sense.
Yeah.
And the sources mentioned those huge reservoirs at Dolavira too, right? For storing water.
Absolutely. Massive structures, clearly for holding water, probably for agriculture as well as drinking. Really impressive water management.
Okay, so after the harvest, you got to process the food, grinding grains and all that. The sources mention these saddle querns.
Yes, McKay, the archaeologist at Mohenjo-Daro, found loads of them. They were the main tool for grinding cereals. Basically, big, rough stones, often gritty rock, usually with a curved base. You'd have to wedge them into the ground or some mud to keep them steady while you worked.
And he said there were 2 types.
Yeah, broadly. One where you'd push or roll a smaller stone back and forth on the base, probably for grain, and another type where you used a second stone, more like a pounder, which would create a hollow in the base stone over time.
And didn't Mackay say his workers called those curry stones?
He did. It's a great little detail. He said his cook even wanted to borrow one from the museum. It really shows how archaeologists sometimes use present-day analogies like what a cook uses today to try and understand ancient tools. It can be useful, but you have to be careful, especially, as we'll see, with things like religion.
Right. Okay, from food to buildings, let's talk about the big one. The planned cities. Mohenjo-Daro is the famous one now, but Harappa was found first.
Yeah, and poor Harappa got really badly damaged before anyone knew what it was. Your sources mention brick robbers taking huge amounts of bricks in the 1800s to build a railway line. Cunningham thought maybe enough for 100 miles of track. Just imagine. Mohenjo-Daro was luckier, much better preserved.
And Mohenjo-Daro's layout is just so striking. Divided into the citadel, smaller, higher up on these huge mud brick platforms, and the lower town, much bigger, also on platform, and walled.
Exactly, and those platforms, they weren't small. Just building the foundations might have taken something like 4 million person-days of labor. That sheer scale tells you something about how they could organize work.
And it wasn't random growth, was it? The sources stress, it looks like it was planned before they built anything. Building only happened on those platform areas.
Clear sign of planning, yeah, and authority. And then there are the bricks themselves. Incredible uniformity. Sun-dried or baked, they all had the same ratio length, 4 times the height, breadth, twice the height.
And that wasn't just in Mohenjo-Daro.
Nope. That exact same ratio was used at all Harappan settlements across that entire massive region. It's mind-boggling standardization for that era.
Wow. So that basic citadel or town plan was common, but maybe variations existed? Dolavira and Lothal were different.
Yeah, the sources mention those. At Dolavira and Lothal, the whole settlement seems to have been fortified, maybe with internal walled sections too. And at Lothal, the citadel wasn't separately walled, just built higher up. So variations on a theme. But one feature that really stands out everywhere is that drainage system. Just incredible. Mackay called it the most complete ancient system found up to his time.
It sounds like serious engineering. Roads and streets laid out first, roughly on a grid pattern.
Pretty much, yeah. Intersecting at right angles. And the key thing is, the streets with the drains seem to have been built first. Then people built houses along them. Each house had to have at least one wall along the street so its drains could connect up.
Every house. Connected to street drains?
Seems like it, yes. The main channels were made of brick set in mortar, covered with loose bricks or sometimes big limestone slabs you could lift off to clean them.
And they even thought about solids. Sumps or something.
Yeah, little pits or sumps in the house drains. The idea was solid waste would settle there, and only the wastewater flowed out into the street drains. And the street drains themselves had sumps at intervals for cleaning. We even have evidence they did clean them little piles of sand and stuff found alongside the channels.
That's amazing foresight.
Yeah.
And not just in the big cities, even smaller places like Lothal had proper drains, even if the houses were mud brick.
That's right. Burnt brick drains connected to a system. This level of planning, sanitation, It wasn't just cosmetic. It seems fundamental to how they lived in these urban centers. It really points towards a society that valued order and, well, public health on a large scale. Does it prove town planning? I mean, the evidence is pretty darn strong, wouldn't you say?
It certainly sounds like it. Okay, so stepping inside those houses in the lower town, what were they like?
Many seem to be built around a central courtyard. That would have been the hub of activity cooking, weaving maybe, especially in hot weather,
Makes sense. And they cared about privacy. No windows on the ground floor facing the street.
Seems that way. And the main entrance often didn't give you a direct view inside into the courtyard. A deliberate design choice.
And bathrooms.
Every house seems to have had its own bathroom, paved with bricks, with drains connecting right into that street system we talked about. And stairs suggest upper floors, or at least roof access. The roof might have been used space, too.
And the wells. So many wells. The sources estimate 700 just in Mohenjo-Daro.
Incredible, isn't it? Many houses had their own well, often in a room accessible from outside. Maybe for passersby to use. The whole water supply infrastructure is just staggering to think about.
Okay, let's move up to the Citadel. This is for, public buildings, special functions.
Seems likely. The sources mention a couple of key structures there. One is a massive warehouse. Well, the lower brick part remains. Any upper wooden parts decayed long ago.
And the other big one is the Great Bath. Sounds pretty grand.
It is a large rectangular tank sunk into a courtyard, corridors all around it, steps leading down from the north and south. And they made it watertight bricks laid on edge, set with gypsum mortar. Very careful construction.
And there were rooms around it.
And a well.
Yep, rooms on 3 sides, one with a big well, presumably the water source. And the water from the tank could be drained out into a huge drain nearby. Plus, there was another building close by with 8 small bathrooms, all neatly arranged with their own drains.
So what was it for? The interpretation is ritual bathing. That's the prevailing idea, yeah. Given how unique it is, how carefully built, its location on the Citadel with other special buildings, it strongly suggests some kind of important ritual function involving water.
Beyond buildings, how do archaeologists try to figure out social differences, like rich and poor?
It's tricky without writing, but they used a few strategies. One is looking at burials, how people were buried.
So the dead were usually put in pits. Some pits were lined with bricks. Could that be a status thing?
Possibly. It's hard to be certain just from that. Some graves do have pottery or ornaments buried with the person maybe suggesting beliefs about an afterlife, or just things they used. Interestingly, jewelry is found with both men and women.
Oh yeah, the source mentioned a male burial from the 80s at Harappa that had shell rings, beads.
Right, and sometimes copper mirrors show up. But the big picture, especially compared to somewhere like Egypt at the same time, is that the Harappans generally didn't seem to bury huge amounts of treasure or precious wealth with their dead. No pyramids packed with gold.
Interesting difference. What about the objects themselves? Distinguishing everyday stuff from luxuries.
Yeah, that's another approach. Archaeologists classify artifacts. Utilitarian things are for daily use, common materials like clay or stone, easy to make, found everywhere. Things like querns, basic pots, needles,
And luxuries are the opposite. Rare, expensive materials, hard to make, like those faience pots.
Exactly. It's like a glazed ceramic made from ground quartz. Making those little pots was complicated, so they're considered a luxury. But it gets fuzzy.
How so?
Well, what about something useful, like a spindle whorl for spinning, but made out of that fancy faience? Is it utility or luxury? It complicates the simple categories.
Ah, right. So how do they sort that out? Does where they find it help?
Distribution is key, yeah. Rare objects made of valuable materials tend to show up much more in the big settlements, Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa. They're much rarer in the smaller towns like Kalabongan.
So the fancy stuff concentrated the cities, like those little faience pots, maybe for perfume?
Exactly. Mostly found in the big urban centers. And gold, while rare overall, seems precious then, now. When it is found, it's often in hoards.
Hoards? Like buried treasure?
Sort of. Collections of objects, maybe hidden away for safekeeping or intended for reuse or just lost together. Finding gold in hoards rather than routinely in graves is another clue, perhaps, about how they viewed wealth and the afterlife compared to others. This concentration of luxury goods in cities definitely points towards some kind of social and economic hierarchy.
Okay, let's talk about making stuff. Craft production. The sources mention Mohenjo-Daro. a tiny place totally focused on crafts.
It's a fascinating site, only about 7 hectares tiny compared to Mohenjo-Daro's 125, but seems almost exclusively devoted to craft work. Bead making, cutting shells, metalwork, making seals, making weights, a real industrial zone.
And the variety of beads they made is just incredible.
Yeah.
All those different stones, carnelian, jasper, crystal, metals, shell, faience.
An amazing range of materials, yeah. And shapes, too. Discs, cylinders, barrels, segmented ones, some decorated by carving, painting, even etching designs onto them.
The techniques must have been pretty advanced, like working steatite.
Steatite's a very soft stone, so it's relatively easy to carve. They could even grind it into a paste and mold it. How they made those super tiny steatite microbeads, though, that's still a bit of a puzzle.
And carnelian, that red stone.
Right. They figured out how to fire the yellowish raw material, or maybe beads already shaped, to get that beautiful deep red color. The whole process, chipping the rough shape, flaking it finer, grinding, polishing, and then drilling the hole required a lot of skill. They found specialized drills at Chanhudaro, Lothal, and Dolavira. Dedicated tools for the job.
So how do archaeologists know for sure that crafting was happening at a specific site like Chanhudaro?
They look for the whole production chain, basically.
Yeah.
Finding the raw materials, lumps of stone, whole shells, copper ore as a start. Then you look for the tools used to work them.
Unfinished objects, too, things that broke.
Exactly. Unfinished items, rejects, things that cracked or broke during manufacture. And crucially, waste material. The little offcuts, the flakes, the dust from grinding. Finding concentrations of that waste is a really strong indicator that production was happening right there.
Makes sense. So was it all happening in specialized centers like Chanhudaro? Or in the big cities, too?
Looks like both. We definitely have specialized centers like Nageshwar and Balakot near the coast, focused on shell working. But there's also clear evidence for craft production happening within the large cities, like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa themselves.
So maybe the finished goods, like fancy beads from Chanhudaro, were then shipped off to the big cities.
That seems very likely, yeah.
Yeah.
Transported to the urban centers for trade, used by elites, maybe further distribution.
Which brings us to trade and getting materials. A lot of this stuff, copper, lapis, nice stone, wasn't just lying around in the Indus Valley, was it?
No, definitely not. They needed stone, timber, metals, things beyond the local clay. They clearly had ways to get them. We see toy models of bullock carts, so land transport was used.
And rivers, the Indus. Coastal routes.
Almost certainly. River transport would have been efficient, and coastal routes too, especially for bulkier items or longer distances. The sources outline a couple of main strategies for getting these materials.
Okay, what were they?
One was to actually set up Harappan settlements near the resource areas, like Nageshwar and Balakot for shell, as we said. Shortahai, way up in Afghanistan, seems placed to access lapis lazuli, and Lothal in Gujarat was near sources of carnelian, steatite, maybe metal.
So setting up shop near the source, what was the other way?
Sending out expeditions. Targeted trips to resource-rich areas, like the Khetri region in Rajasthan, which is rich in copper, or maybe down to South India for gold.
How do we know they did that? Find Harappan stuff there.
Exactly. Finding occasional Harappan artifacts, like those distinctive steatite microbeads, in these areas suggests contact interaction with the local people living there. In the Khetri region, there was another culture, the Ganeshwar Jodhpura culture, known for its copper objects. It's quite possible they were supplying copper to the Harappans through these expeditions or trade contacts.
And this network went even further, didn't it? Beyond India and Pakistan, out towards the Middle East.
Oh yeah, definitely. Some really exciting recent work suggests copper was coming all the way from Oman in the Arabian Peninsula.
Oman. How can they tell?
Chemical analysis. They found that copper from Oman and some Harappan copper artifacts share the same trace elements, specifically nickel. It strongly points to a common geological source, a shared origin.
Wow. Any other clues for Oman?
There are. They've found these large Harappan storage jars in Oman, coated inside with thick black clay. The coating might have stopped liquids seeping out. Maybe they were trading something in the jars for the Omani copper.
Fascinating. And Mesopotamia? Modern Iraq. There was contact there, too.
Absolutely. This is where ancient texts come in. Mesopotamian writings from the 3rd millennium BCE, that's the right time period, mention trade with places called Dilmun.
Which may be Bahrain.
Probably Bahrain, yes. And Magan.
Possibly Oman.
Possibly Oman, fitting with the copper evidence. And, crucially, a place called Meluha.
And Meluha is.
Widely believed by archaeologists to be the Harappan region itself.
And the texts say what came from Meluha.
Valuable stuff. Carnelian, lapis lazuli, copper, gold, various kinds of wood. Things we know the Harappans had access to and traded. There's even a Mesopotamian myth mentioning Meluha's Haja bird, so think maybe that's the peacock.
A peacock, cool. How do they travel between these places? By sea.
Most likely, especially for bulk goods. The Mesopotamian texts actually call Meluha a land of seafarers. Plus, we see pictures of ships and boats on some Harappan seals.
And did anything go the other way? Mesopotamian stuff in the Indus? Or shared styles?
There's evidence of exchange, yes. A Mesopotamian cylinder seal found with a Harappan bull design on it. Those round Persian Gulf-type seals, often found in Bahrain, Dilmun, sometimes have Harappan motifs. And even weights found in Dilmun seem to follow the Harappan system.
So it wasn't just one-way traffic. It really connects these ancient worlds. It's amazing how these small finds a seal here, a pot shard there, can reveal such a huge network thousands of years ago.
It really shrinks the ancient world, doesn't it? Okay, let's look at some of those really iconic Harappan objects. The seals, the script, the weights. These seem central.
Right. The seals and sealings, they were for trade, like signing a package.
Pretty much, yeah. Especially for long-distance communication and security. You'd tie up your bundle of goods, slap some wet clay on the knot, and press your seal into it. If the clay sealing arrived unbroken, the recipient knew the goods hadn't been messed with, and the seal itself identified who sent it, like a combination lock and sender ID.
And the seals themselves usually have writing on them. And an animal.
Yes, typically a line of script, maybe the owner's name or title, we assume, and often a beautifully carved animal motif. Perhaps the animal helped identify the owner if you couldn't read the script. Just speculation, of course.
Ah, the script again. The big enigma. Still undeciphered.
Still completely undeciphered. Most inscriptions are really short. The longest one known has only about 26 signs. It's definitely not alphabetic like our writing it has somewhere between 375 and 400 different signs. Too many for an alphabet, too few for a fully logographic system like early Chinese, maybe.
And they wrote right to left.
Seems that way usually. You can sometimes tell because on longer seals, the signs on the right have more space around them and they get kind of squished together towards the left end of the line, as if the writer was running out of room.
Where else does this writing show up? Not just seals.
Oh, it's found on lots of things. Copper tools, the rims of pottery jars, little tablets made of copper or terracotta, even jewelry, bone rods, and famously, what looks like a large signboard found at Dolavira with big signs.
A signboard. Wow. So if it's on all these different everyday objects, does that mean lots of people could read and write? Was literacy widespread?
That's a huge question we just can't answer yet. It could have been, or maybe only certain scribes or officials could read and write. We just don't know. Maybe they wrote on perishable things too, like palm leaves or cloth that haven't survived.
Okay, and the weights, you mentioned them earlier, a precise system.
Incredibly precise and standardized, usually cubes made of chert, a type of stone, and strangely they have no markings on them at all.
No numbers. How did they work?
The system itself was the key. The smaller weights follow a binary progression, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, up to a very large number, 12,800 times the base unit. Then the higher denominations switched to a decimal system. The tiny ones were likely used for weighing valuable things like beads or maybe metals. They've also found metal scale pans, so they definitely had the whole weighing apparatus.
This standardization, again, bricks, weights, city layouts. It all points to a really organized society. Complex decisions being made, labor being mobilized. So who was calling the shots? Who was in charge?
That is perhaps the most frustrating question. Because the archaeology gives us almost no direct answers. We don't find obvious palaces overflowing with royal treasures, or giant statues clearly depicting kings or queens like you see in Egypt or Mesopotamia around the same time.
The sources mention they called one big building at Mohenjo-daro a palace, but found nothing spectacular inside.
Right, no clear signs of royalty. And then there's that famous little stone statue, the one often called Priest King.
Why Priest King?
It's mainly an analogy based on similar figures and titles in Mesopotamia, but honestly, we know so little about Harappan rituals or political structures. Connecting that statue directly to political power is just speculation. We don't know if they even had priests or kings in the way Mesopotamia did.
So what do archaeologists think? Is there debate?
Oh, huge debate. It's fascinating. Some scholars argue maybe there were no rulers in the way we think of them. Maybe it was a more egalitarian society, somehow collectively managed.
Really, with cities this complex?
Others suggest maybe there were several rulers, perhaps one for each major city or region, like competing city-states.
Okay.
But then many others argue that the sheer uniformity we see, the bricks, the weights, the seals, the town planning principles, those resource procurement settlements spread over such a vast area, makes a single overarching state the most likely explanation. It's hard to imagine separate communities all independently deciding to use the exact same brick size,
Yeah, that seems unlikely.
So the argument goes, there must have been some kind of centralized authority making and enforcing these standards, but how it was organized, who wielded the power, and why they didn't leave clearer traces of that power. That remains a huge mystery. It really forces us to ask, how did this incredibly sophisticated organized society work without the obvious markers of central rule we expect from the ancient world? And this leads us to another massive mystery. The end. What happened to this civilization? The evidence shows that around 1800 BCE, things started to change significantly. Many sites, especially in the Khalistan desert area, seem to have been abandoned.
But people didn't just vanish. They moved.
It looks like populations shifted. There was an expansion into new areas, particularly eastward and southward into Gujarat, Haryana, western Uttar Pradesh.
Okay, so a shift in location. But what about the culture itself? In the places that stayed occupied after 1900 BCE?
That's where you see a real transformation. All those distinctive things that define the mature Harappan period, the standardized weights, the seals, the script, those special beads, certain pottery styles, the long-distance trade networks, the high level of craft specialization, they all seem to disappear.
Gone.
Just like that.
Pretty much fades away, yeah. They started using fewer types of materials, making fewer kinds of specialized goods. Even house-building techniques seemed to decline in quality, and they stopped constructing those large, monumental public structures.
So what replaced it?
What emerges seems to be a more rural way of life, more localized cultures. Archaeologists often call this the late Harappan or post-urban phase. The cities declined or were abandoned.
Why? What caused this huge shift? Climate change? Floods?
Lots of theories have been proposed over the years exactly like those. Climate shifts, deforestation leading to erosion or floods, rivers changing course or drying up. The Gagar-Hakra river system seems to have declined, maybe overuse of the land around the cities.
But the sources say those might explain local problems, but not the collapse of the whole system. That's the problem, yeah. Any one of those could cause trouble in one area, but it's hard to see how it would bring down the entire civilization across such a vast and environmentally diverse region simultaneously.
So maybe it wasn't just one thing.
It seems more likely that whatever held the whole system together, that unifying element, maybe the Harappan state or political structure, whatever it was, somehow broke down or ended. The disappearance of the seals, the script, the standard weights, the decline of cities, the end of that broad uniformity. It points to a systemic collapse rather than just a series of local disasters.
And it was a major collapse.
Yeah.
No big cities, again, in that part of the world for over 1,000 years, right?
That huge gap in urbanism, yeah. A very long time before cities reemerged elsewhere in the subcontinent. Now, within this whole collapse discussion, there's that specific older debate about whether an invasion played a role. Your sources bring this up.
Right. This goes back to the early excavations. Marshall at Mohenjo-Daro found skeletons scattered around, some in a place they called Dead Men Lane. He thought it looked like a massacre.
Yes. And then Mortimer Wheeler in the 1940s took that idea and linked it to the Rig Veda, the ancient Indian texts. The Rig Veda talks about forts, and the god Indra as a fort destroyer, Puramdara.
So Wheeler thought the Harappan cities were the forts, and Indra and the Aryans mentioned in the Veda destroyed them, using the skeletons as proof.
That was his theory, yes. He proposed an Aryan invasion, led by Indra, was responsible for the destruction of the Harappan civilization. It was quite influential for a time.
But then someone else re-examined it, George Dales.
Exactly. In the 1960s, Dales took a hard look at the actual archaeological evidence Wheeler cited. He found the skeletons weren't all from the same time. They belonged to different periods. He called the burials, if you can call them that, really sloppy, not evidence of a single battle or massacre.
And no signs of widespread destruction, burning, weapons.
Crucially, no. No layer of destruction across the city, no mass burning associated with the skeletons, no bodies of warriors with weapons found in a battle context. And the citadel, the main fortified area, showed no signs of a final siege or defense.
So Dales basically debunked the massacre theory and the invasion theory based on it.
Pretty much. His careful reanalysis showed the archaeological evidence just didn't support Wheeler's interpretation of a violent conquest causing the collapse. It's a classic case study in archaeology, how re-examining the evidence can completely change our understanding. The invasion theory, based on that specific evidence anyway, largely fell apart. It's incredible to think that after these cities fell silent, they were just forgotten for thousands of years.
Yeah, people living nearby later would find odd bits, seals, pottery, but had no idea what they were part of.
Yeah.
The sources talk about Alexander Cunningham, the first head of the Archaeological Survey of India, and his confusion.
Right, mid-19th century. His main interest was later Indian history, stuff documented by texts, like accounts from Chinese pilgrims who visited Buddhist sites much later. Harappa just didn't fit. It wasn't on the pilgrim routes, wasn't known as an ancient city from those later texts.
So even when he saw Harappan things, he got one of those seals. In 1875, he couldn't place them. He missed how old they were.
Completely missed the significance. Yeah. He thought real Indian history started much later, with the cities in the Ganges Valley. Harappa was just an anomaly he couldn't explain within his framework.
It took until the early 20th century for the penny to drop, with finds at Harappa and then Mohenjo-Daro.
Yes. Dayaram Sani found more seals at Harappa, crucially in much older layers than Cunningham cared about. Then Rakal Das Banerjee found similar seals at Mohenjo-Daro. They realized these sites were linked, part of the same, very old culture.
And John Marshall, who was in charge then, announced it to the world in 1924, realizing it was as old as Mesopotamia.
Exactly. He made the connection. It was a huge revelation. As someone wrote later, S.N. Roy, Marshall left India 3,000 years older than he had found her.
That's how.
A massive shift in understanding the depth of history there. And Marshall was interested in everyday life, not just monuments.
But his digging methods weren't great. He missed the layers.
That was the downside, yeah. He tended to excavate in big horizontal chunks, removing layers without carefully recording the stratigraphy, the sequence of deposits. A lot of crucial contextual information was lost that way.
That was fixed later by Wheeler, with his military precision.
Mortimer Wheeler, yes. When he became Director General in 1944, he insisted on following the stratigraphy meticulously. Very disciplined approach. Your sources even have a quote from him about arriving at Harappa. Gives you a real sense of the intensity back then.
And then after partition in 1947, many big sites were in Pakistan. So Indian archaeologists started looking more intensely within India.
That's right. It spurred a wave of exploration in India, leading to the discovery and excavation of major sites like Kalibangan in Rajasthan, Lothal in Gujarat, Rakhi Garhi in Haryana, Dhalavira also in Gujarat. A whole new chapter opened up.
And work continues. New techniques, international teams.
Absolutely. Since the 1980s especially, there's been a lot more international collaboration, joint projects at Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, using modern methods like detailed surface surveys, geophysical prospection, sophisticated analysis of materials. It keeps yielding new insights.
So after all this work, over a century now, what are the really big challenges left in figuring out this civilization?
Well, number one, without a doubt, is the undeciphered script. We just can't read what they wrote. Assuming they wrote down things like history or beliefs, we're stuck interpreting the silent material evidence.
And that material evidence itself has limits, right? Things rot.
Exactly. Organic stuff, cloth, wood, leather, food mostly disappears over time, especially in that climate. What survives tends to be the durable stuff. Stone, ceramics, burnt clay, metal, shell. Plus, what we find is often the stuff people threw away: broken pots, worn-out tools. Useful, but maybe not representative of everything they had. Valuable things were probably recycled, melted down, or kept carefully, maybe passed down or hoarded. Finding intact, valuable items is often pure luck, not the norm.
So archaeologists have to classify what they do find by material, but also by function, how it was used.
Right. And figuring out function can be tough. Sometimes it's obvious a pot looks like a pot, or the context helps found in a grave. It's likely related to burial rites. Found in a workshop area, maybe it's a tool.
But sometimes it's guesswork, like figuring out clothes from statues.
Yeah, you rely on indirect clues. An interpretation always needs a frame of reference. Remember Cunningham and that first seal? It only made sense once more were found, put in sequence, and compared to places like Mesopotamia. Context is everything.
Which brings us back to interpretation problems, especially with religion. That seems like the trickiest area.
It really is. Early archaeologists especially tended to jump to religious explanations for anything unusual or striking.
Like all those terracotta female figurines.
Yeah.
Automatically labeled mother goddesses.
Pretty much, yeah. Or calling that statue the priest king based on Mesopotamian parallels we don't even know apply. Or assuming the Great Bath must be for rituals, or that fire altars found at some sites were definitely religious.
And the seals, too. Trying to read beliefs from the pictures, ritual scenes, nature worship from plants. What about the unicorn?
All open to interpretation. That famous seal with the seated figure in a sort of yogic pose, surrounded by animals, often called Proto-Shiva.
Proto-Shiva, because of later Hindu iconography.
Exactly. Or those cone-shaped stones found at some sites suggested as possible lingas, symbols associated with Shiva later on. The problem here is using much later religious traditions, like Hinduism, as a direct key to unlock the beliefs of this much older, unrelated, as far as we know for sure, civilization.
Working backwards from the known to the unknown.
Precisely. It might work okay for understanding a simple tool like a kern, but applying it to complex religious symbols and beliefs thousands of years apart is highly speculative. That Proto-Shiva figure, for instance, doesn't really match descriptions of the god Rudra in the Rig Veda, which is much closer in time, though still later. Could it be a shaman? Something else entirely.
It's a minefield of assumptions.
It is. And Mackay himself, back then, admitted he couldn't be sure if those conical stones were religious objects or just pieces for playing some kind of game. It really highlights the limits when you don't have text to guide you.
So pulling it all together, after this deep dive, where do we stand now? What do we actually know? And what's still fuzzy?
Well, I think we have a pretty decent handle on their economy, the farming, the crafts, the trade networks. We can see some evidence hinting at social differences. We understand the practical functioning of their cities, the infrastructure. That's fairly solid.
But the big picture, the politics, the beliefs, still lots of question marks.
Huge question marks. How was society organized? Was the Great Bath definitely ritual? How common was literacy? Why do the burials seem relatively simple if there were elites? These are still debated.
In other areas, like gender roles, what women did.
Very little direct evidence. Did women make pottery or just paint it? What was the meaning of all those female figurines? Gender is definitely an area where much more research is needed, trying to find subtle clues in the material record.
Wow, okay. That really was a deep dive into the Harappan civilization, working just from the sources you gave us.
Yeah, we've explored this culture that, achieved incredible things. Amazing urban planning, that standardization across huge distances, sophisticated drains, trade networks reaching Oman and Mesopotamia, all built on clever farming and skilled crafts.
Yet even with all that stuff, they left the bricks, beads, bones, buildings. So much is still open to interpretation, isn't it? Still debated. How they were ruled, what they believed, why exactly they declined.
It's a constant process of discovery and reevaluation, a really powerful reminder of just how challenging but also how exciting it is to try and piece together a complex human past from just the fragments that survive thousands of years later.
Maybe the most provocative thought to leave you, the listener, with, thinking about everything we've discussed, is this. What does it really mean that one of the most distinctive features of this advanced, organized, sophisticated society, their own writing system, is still completely silent to us? How different would our understanding be? How much richer if we could actually read their words, hear their voices?
It's the ultimate puzzle, isn't it? And it's what keeps archaeologists digging, scholars debating, and the Harappan story so compelling.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back with another exploration soon.